Picture a medieval courtroom. The air is thick with incense and judgment. At the center, a woman stands trembling, not accused of theft or murder, but of something far more surreal, stealing men's private parts and keeping them as pets in a bird's nest, feeding them oats and corn like caged animals. Across town, in another chamber of justice, a pig faces prosecution, not for biting, not for trampling, but for committing unspeakable intimacy with its owner. Both pig and man face the same sentence, death by fire. And in the red light district, prostitutes in yellow hoods with bells prepare for a royal welcome. When the emperor arrives, they will bind him in golden chains as part of the city's official ceremony. This was the Middle Ages, a world so strange that even professional historians ignored certain records for centuries. Not because they were lost, but because they were too bizarre, too humiliating, and too unbelievable. Forget the picture book image of repressed peasants and pure knights. The real Middle Ages were not a story of silence and chastity. They were a theater of contradictions where sexuality was public, politicized, and at times, terrifyingly absurd. In this forgotten world, wives could be ordered by courts to stimulate their husbands in front of judges to prove impotence. Physicians prescribed orgasms as medicine for women whose wombs were said to wander restlessly through their bodies. And legal codes declared that if a woman conceived during an assault, her pregnancy was proof she had consented. These weren't whispered rumors or exaggerated folk tales. They were laws, rituals, and punishments woven into the fabric of daily life. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. At the heart of this strange system was the institution that claimed to regulate not only the soul but also the body, the Catholic Church. Its grip on marriage, intimacy, and even private affection was ironclad. Imagine living in 13th century France. You are married in the eyes of the Church. You long for closeness with your spouse, yet desire itself is surrounded by restrictions so complicated that modern scholars have made flowcharts to keep track of them. Sundays? Forbidden, it was the Lord's Day. Fridays? Off limits, Christ had died on a Friday. Thursdays were barred to honor the Last Supper. Entire seasons, Lent, Advent, and dozens of saints' feast days scattered through the year, were cloaked in abstinence. A wife menstruating? Unclean, untouchable. A mother nursing? Sex might corrupt the milk and poison the infant. In Germany, one penitential prescribed 3 years of fasting on bread and water for couples caught being intimate during breastfeeding. Add up the restricted days, and a devout Christian couple could legally have relations less than once a week. Even when the calendar permitted, the act itself was suffocated by rules. Only missionary position was acceptable. Woman on top, 40 days penance. From behind, in the manner of dogs, 3 years. Any position that blocked conception, 7 years of punishment. The Canons of Theodore, a manual from the 7th century still circulated in the medieval age, declared that spilling seed into the mouth was worse than murder, worse than heresy. The logic was clear. Sex was not for joy but for reproduction alone. And yet, even when reproduction was the goal, pleasure was perilous. Too much enthusiasm? Sin. Lingering embraces? Sin. Noise? Sin. A French bishop prescribed penance for couples who took too long, who smiled too much, who seemed to enjoy one another's company beyond the bare necessity. The ideal Christian encounter, according to these texts, should be silent, brief, and performed without pleasure, as if compelled by duty alone. But here lies the hypocrisy that defines so much of medieval sexuality. The same priests and bishops who preached suffocating restraint were regular visitors to brothels. Their solution? Not to stop but to tax the sin. The collegium, a fornication fee, allowed priests to keep mistresses so long as they paid the church. In medieval England and Germany, account books list these payments right alongside burial and baptism fees, as routine as any other form of income. In Norwich in 1450, parish priests paid the fornication tax as casually as one might pay a tithe. In some regions of Germany, nearly a third of priests were officially registered as fornicators, yet unpunished. The contradictions went deeper still. Monasteries, supposed sanctuaries of purity, often became hotbeds of scandal, their cloistered walls echoing with transgression. Behind the silence of the cloister lay stories so grotesque that they blur the line between history and nightmare. And it is in those hidden walls, in the stories of nuns and monks, that we will next find the most chilling and grotesque examples of how sexuality and punishment collided in the medieval world. The Church's moral authority was supposed to stand as a shield against temptation, a fortress of purity in a world of sin. Yet that fortress had cracks everywhere. Behind the solemn walls of monasteries and convents, desire seeped through like water through stone. The records we inherit from medieval chroniclers reveal not sacred silence but scandal, cruelty, and a disturbing obsession with punishment. One of the most infamous cases came from 12th century England, the Nun of Wotton. A young girl, given to the convent as a child, forced there not by divine calling, but because her family had no use for her in marriage or inheritance. This practice, called oblation, was common. Daughters deemed excess mouths to feed were locked into cloisters, destined for a life of enforced chastity and obedience. But childhood vows could not silence the body's awakening. When this girl grew older, she formed an illicit bond with a lay brother. Their relationship, a rebellion against confinement, was discovered. What followed was no ordinary punishment. According to Abbot Allard of Rievaulx, her fellow nuns seized the man and dragged him before her. Then, in an act of terrifying ritual, they forced her to castrate him with her own hands. The scene was not merely disciplinary, it was theater. A grotesque drama of sin and purification, staged for the community's eyes. But the horror did not end there. The severed organs, still bleeding, were thrust into her mouth by another nun, as if swallowing shame itself could cleanse her soul. Then came the miracle. The chronicles claim her pregnancy vanished. To her sisters, this was not cruelty, but divine absolution. She was welcomed back into the convent as purified. To modern readers, the episode reads like a nightmare. Yet it reveals something crucial. Medieval sexuality was not just about sin. It was about control. The convent, the monastery, the courtroom. These were not only places of worship or judgment but theaters where bodies were disciplined, humiliated, and reshaped into symbols. A young nun's suffering became a sermon in flesh, her body a living warning of what happened when desire broke free. And cases like hers were far from isolated. Monasteries throughout Europe were repeatedly accused of scandal. In some accounts, monks were discovered keeping secret lovers, or entire convents were condemned as houses of lust. Reformers railed against the brothels of Babylon hidden behind cloister walls. For ordinary people, these tales were both shocking and strangely satisfying. They revealed that even those who claimed holiness were just as human, just as fallible as anyone else. At the same time, the institutional church continued its paradoxical balancing act. On one side, priests thundered from pulpits about the dangers of lust, prescribing impossible restrictions for married couples. On the other, the same institution profited from sex by regulating and taxing brothels, by inventing ways to pardon the very sins it condemned. The hypocrisy was not hidden, it was bureaucratized. Sin became a source of revenue, indulgences a currency of salvation. It is here that medieval medicine enters the stage, and in many ways, it only deepened the chaos. For while the church sought to police sex through ritual and penance, physicians tried to explain it with theories drawn from antiquity. The results were catastrophic. Ancient errors, recycled and given new authority, produced a worldview where the female body was seen as dangerous, unstable, and always in need of male governance. And so, when medicine and morality intertwined, the consequences for women, and for justice itself, were devastating. If the church sought to govern desire through penance and law, medieval medicine sought to govern it through theories, and those theories were disastrously wrong. Physicians of the age were steeped in the writings of ancient Greek and Roman authorities, particularly Galen, whose medical texts were copied and revered long after the fall of Rome. But what they preserved was not truth, it was error transformed into doctrine. One of the most influential ideas was the two-seed theory. According to this belief, both men and women produced seed, and both had to release it during intercourse for conception to occur. Without mutual pleasure, no pregnancy was possible. William of Conches, tutor to the future King Henry II, argued passionately for this view in the 1150s. Generation, he claimed, required the emission of seed from both partners, and that meant pleasure was not merely incidental, it was necessary. This had devastating consequences in the courts. If conception required a woman's orgasm, then pregnancy itself became proof that she had consented. Rape accusations, already stacked against victims, became nearly impossible to uphold. In legal texts like Fleta from 13th century England, judges declared plainly, if she should have conceived by the rape, the charge must be dropped, for without a woman's consent she could not conceive. The horror of this logic is almost unbearable. A woman assaulted, brutalized, and left pregnant was forced to face her attacker in court, only to be told that her very pregnancy condemned her as a liar. This was not an isolated notion. Across medieval Europe, in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, court records show rape charges dismissed on these grounds. One chilling example is that of Lady Isabel Butler in 15th century Ireland. She was abducted, assaulted repeatedly, and forced into marriage with her attacker. When she became pregnant, the courts ruled it could not have been rape. Her attacker was not punished but legitimized, her suffering erased by the twisted marriage of bad medicine and cruel law. Yet medicine did not merely condemn women in court, it turned their bodies into perpetual sites of suspicion. Physicians believed the womb was a restless, wandering organ, capable of roaming through the body when deprived of sexual release. This wandering womb could supposedly cause fainting, seizures, or madness, a condition they called hysteria. The cure, naturally, was sexual activity. For married women, regular intercourse with their husbands. For widows, spinsters, or nuns, the treatment was manual stimulation, performed by midwives or physicians, until orgasm was reached. This medicalized sexuality transformed intimacy into therapy, and women's pleasure, or more accurately their management by others, became a clinical duty. Centuries later, this very practice would inspire the invention of the vibrator in the 19th century, marketed not as an object of desire but as a medical device for hysterical women. The roots of that story stretch back here, to the dimly lit chambers of medieval medicine, where men with titles prescribed pleasure as cure while denying women any agency in how that pleasure was given or understood. The underlying fear was always the same, that the female body was unstable, dangerous, and in constant need of governance, by priests, by husbands, by doctors. Medieval culture treated women less as human beings and more as vessels of risk, their biology a threat to spiritual order and social harmony. And yet the irony is stark. For all the obsession with control, medicine and law alike dragged sex into the public arena. Bodies became subjects for examination, trials, and humiliations. Nowhere was this clearer than in the bizarre practice that awaited couples in marital disputes, the trial by Congress. When a wife sought annulment on grounds of her husband's impotence, the medieval courts demanded proof. In an age obsessed with turning private matters into public theater, the solution was as humiliating as it was surreal, the trial by Congress. The procedure was precise, almost ritualistic. The couple would be summoned to the bishop's palace, where the case was heard. A panel of matrons, older women deemed experts in such matters, first examined the man's body. They inspected him for deformities, and in some cases even attempted to manually arouse him. If these preliminary tests proved inconclusive, the case moved to its final stage, intercourse under observation. The couple was placed in a bed within a curtained chamber. The matrons stationed themselves at slits in the curtains, watching for signs of erection, penetration, and completion. It was intimacy turned into performance, judged not by love or trust but by witnesses with quills ready to record the outcome. The pressure could be unbearable. The most infamous case came in Paris in 1659, involving the Marquis de Gesvres. His failure to perform under scrutiny became the scandal of the city. Pamphlets and satirical poems circulated, mocking his humiliation. He wilted, as one account put it, like a flower under the matron's gaze. And yet, years later, he remarried and fathered children, proving the absurdity of the entire spectacle. The trial by Congress revealed far more about society's obsession with control than it did about truth. But impotence trials were only one facet of the public punishments that defined medieval sexuality. Adultery, for instance, was never considered a private failing, it was a crime against the community. The punishments were designed not simply to correct but to mark, permanently and visibly. Under the laws of King Nut in 11th century England, an adulterous woman could have her nose and ears cut off. The mutilation was not random cruelty but calculated symbolism. The nose, associated with beauty and status, was destroyed, branding her forever as a sexual transgressor. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletal remains showing women with precisely these mutilations, grim confirmation that these punishments were carried out. The message was clear. The body itself became the legal record, scarred into permanence. In a society where few could read or write, scars and mutilations were the most legible texts of all. Every missing nose, every cropped ear, told a story that needed no parchment. And yet, medieval justice extended its reach beyond human flesh. The same obsession with order, purity, and punishment was imposed on animals. Bestiality was considered the gravest of sexual sins, worse even than incest or sodomy. Both human and animal were prosecuted together as co-conspirators. The animal was not treated as an innocent beast but as a moral participant in the crime. Trials were formal, with defense attorneys appointed for the animals. Witnesses testified about their character. Sometimes, astonishingly, the verdicts were split. In a 16th-century French case, a man named Jacques Ferrand was convicted of relations with a donkey. He was sentenced to death by burning. But the donkey was acquitted. Villagers testified to her virtuous behavior, insisting she had been forced, and the court agreed. The donkey returned to her owner while Ferrand was executed. Other cases ended more grimly. A cow in Normandy was burned alongside her human violator. Pigs, too, were frequently executed. In 1386, one pig was dressed in human clothing and hanged in public, to emphasize its participation in sin. The act was both punishment and ritual, an attempt to cleanse the community of spiritual pollution. To modern eyes, these scenes verge on absurdity. But in the medieval mind they made sense. The world was bound by a universal moral order. If a sin occurred, it stained not just the guilty but the entire community. Justice required not only punishment but purification. By executing both sinner and beast, society believed it was restoring balance to the cosmic scales. This blending of spectacle, humiliation, and moral theater reveals the deep anxieties that haunted medieval Europe. Desire was not simply a private urge, it was a threat to the order of heaven and earth. And when disorder erupted, punishment had to be as visible and symbolic as the crime itself. But the obsession with sin and spectacle would only intensify. For when disease swept across Europe, or when politics demanded scapegoats, sexuality became the easiest weapon to wield. Accusations of lust, sodomy, or unnatural acts would topple entire communities, destroy powerful institutions, and feed the flames of mass hysteria. If adultery and impotence trials turned private acts into public theater, then accusations of deviant sexuality became a weapon of social control. For medieval Europe, desire outside sanctioned marriage was never just a sin, it was a threat to the very order of society and often, the perfect scapegoat when disaster struck. Homosexuality was one of the most persecuted forms of desire. Venice devised its own chilling punishment. Sodomites were tied between two columns in the lagoon and left to drown slowly as the tide rose. Spain's Inquisition favored fire, burning men at the stake for acts considered against nature. But it was Florence that took persecution to a level of bureaucratic obsession. In 1432, the city established the Office of the Knight, a police force dedicated solely to policing homosexual acts. For 70 years, this office patrolled known meeting places, gathered anonymous denunciations dropped into accusation boxes, and even used young men as bait to entrap suspects. The records they left behind are staggering. 17,000 men investigated, nearly half of Florence's adult male population. Some were fined, others branded or pilloried, repeat offenders executed. Yet the detailed records also reveal something unintended, a hidden map of a city's sexual life, names and encounters preserved in ink, showing that even in the shadow of punishment, desire refused to vanish. But when true catastrophe struck, persecution grew darker still. In the 1340s, as the Black Death swept across Europe, entire cities searched for divine explanations. The plague killed indiscriminately, defying prayers and processions. Terrified communities turned to scapegoats. In Bruges in 1348, a man named Jean Vanderden was burned alive, accused of sodomy that supposedly poisoned the air and caused the plague. He was not alone. Across Europe, men and women alike were executed under the belief that their unnatural lusts had summoned God's wrath. Sexual deviance was not just a personal failing, it became a cosmic crime, an invisible contagion that could bring famine, plague, or disaster. This belief made accusations of lust a devastatingly effective political weapon. When King Philip IV of France sought to destroy the powerful Knights Templar in 1307, he accused them not merely of heresy, but of grotesque sexual rituals, orgies, obscene kisses, and humiliation rites in which initiates supposedly kissed the anus of their superiors. Under torture, Templars confessed to anything, but the charges struck a nerve because medieval society was primed to believe that sexual sin and spiritual corruption went hand in hand. With those accusations, Philip dismantled an order that had stood for 2 centuries and seized its vast wealth. By the late medieval period, sexuality had merged with the supernatural in the collective imagination. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch-hunting manual of 1487. Ostensibly a handbook for identifying and prosecuting witches, it reads more like a fevered catalogue of sexual anxieties. It claimed that witches could literally steal men's penises through sorcery, collecting them in birds' nests where they hopped about like living creatures, feeding on oats and corn. One grotesque tale tells of a man who climbed a tree to retrieve his stolen member, only to be told he could not take the largest one. It belonged to the parish priest. This was not written as satire. Educated inquisitors believed it fully, and women, under torture, confessed to these impossible crimes. Medieval art even reflects the obsession. A Tuscan mural from 1265 depicts women harvesting penises from trees like fruit, while a 14th-century manuscript shows a nun calmly plucking them and placing them in a basket. These beliefs show how deeply fear of sex had intertwined with fear of the supernatural. To the medieval mind, sexuality was not just temptation. It was sorcery, a tool of the devil, and a gateway to chaos. And in this climate, rumor and paranoia could destroy lives as effectively as plague or war. Yet, for all the hysteria, many of the most infamous images of medieval sexuality are myths. The droit du seigneur, the supposed right of a lord to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night, never existed, a later invention to paint the Middle Ages as maximally barbaric. Likewise, chastity belts were not instruments of daily control but Renaissance jokes and 19th-century forgeries. Real belts, displayed in museums, have all been proven false, more fantasy than fact. The truth, as always, was stranger. While lords did not claim peasant brides and women were not locked in iron cages, communities instead created systems of regulated prostitution, tolerated sins, and bizarre rituals that feel more alien and more revealing than any myth. And it is into these brothels, these tolerated houses of sin, that we must now step. For they reveal the most practical and perhaps the most surreal way that medieval society confronted desire, not by erasing it but by regulating it, taxing it, and parading it in plain sight, until a new disease brought the entire system crashing down. For all its obsessions with sin, for all the mutilations and humiliations, medieval Europe recognized an undeniable truth. People would have sex no matter what the church decreed. And so, alongside the sermons in the courts, there existed something deeply pragmatic: regulated brothels. These were not hidden dens and shadowed alleys. They were official municipal institutions, licensed and taxed by the church itself. In London, the most infamous were called the Bishop of Winchester's geese, because it was the Bishop of Winchester who issued their permits. The irony was staggering. The same men who thundered from pulpits against fornication grew rich from the very act they condemned. In the diocesan account books, prostitution appears as just another line of income, recorded alongside tithes, baptisms, and burial fees. The rules that governed these brothels were as strange as they were strict. In Nuremberg, married men were barred from visiting on Sundays. In Milan, prostitutes were forced to wear black cloaks with yellow stripes. In Leipzig, they wore yellow hoods with bells that jingled as they walked, so no man could claim he had been deceived. And sometimes, the women themselves were drawn into civic ceremonies. When Emperor Frederick III entered Nuremberg in 1471, the city's prostitutes met him at the gates, chaining him playfully in golden bonds until he paid a ransom. The emperor, amused, paid and passed, but the ritual revealed the strange mingling of power, sex, and spectacle in medieval life. To medieval authorities, prostitution was not simply tolerated, it was useful. By providing an outlet for desire, it was thought to protect the chastity of wives and daughters. St. Augustine himself had once argued that removing prostitutes from society would unleash chaos, like removing sewers from a palace. The brothel, paradoxically, was both sin and safeguard. But this delicate balance did not last. In 1494, a new and terrifying disease spread across Europe: syphilis. It began in Naples and within 2 years reached Scotland, carried by soldiers, sailors, and merchants. The symptoms were horrifying. First gentle sores, then rashes that covered the body, and finally flesh eaten away, faces collapsing into grotesque wounds. Cities panicked. Brothels that had been licensed for centuries were shuttered almost overnight. Prostitutes were rounded up and confined in grim prison hospitals. Noble marriages were called off when grooms showed signs of infection. The entire system of controlled sin, carefully balanced for generations, collapsed in the face of a disease that made sex itself potentially fatal. And with this collapse came something deeper: a shift in the way Europe thought about sexuality. The medieval model, confession, penance, tolerance through regulation, gave way to the harsher repressions of the early modern world. What had once been treated as a matter of ritual sin became, increasingly, a matter of life and death, of contagion and fear. Looking back, it is tempting to laugh at the absurdities. Pigs put on trial, witches accused of stealing penises, bishops taxing fornication. But beneath the grotesque surface lies something profoundly human. Every bizarre punishment, every cruel humiliation, Every contradictory law was born of the same struggle we still face today, the attempt to impose order on desire, to make sense of an instinct that refuses to be tamed. The medievals failed, of course. How could they not? Their courts, their manuals, their mutilations only reveal how chaotic desire truly is. Yet in their failures they left us a record, court transcripts, penitentials, marginal drawings of penis trees, that reveal a world more alien and at the same time more familiar than we ever imagined. And perhaps that is the true legacy of medieval sexuality, not the myths of chastity belts or lordly rights, but the uncomfortable recognition that humans across centuries will always wrestle with the same force, desire, and that the rules we create around it often say more about our fears than about our flesh.